next year, we are going to broaden our focus. We will always focus on the continent of Africa, but you will see additional areas that we will take up. I want to thank all of the members of the Diplomatic Corps who are here, and I also want to thank all of the panelists who are joining us today. As you know, the topic of this breakfast is understanding the Sahel with a focus on politics, security, and development. And while we were already in the planning area to focus on this topic, recent events in this year further emphasized the need for a broader policy discussion on our security focus in Africa. And let me say that the deaths of the 4 soldiers, we were already undertaking an examination of the U.S. military involvement on the continent of Africa, and we're working closely with our Republican colleague, Adam Kinzinger, to do a congressional delegation looking at U.S. military involvement on the continent of Africa in the first half of next year. And when the deaths of the 4 soldiers occurred, that certainly heightened our need, desire, and interest now in the entire Congress to look at U.S. military involvement. And while we were planning, there were other major events happening on the continent of Africa, as there always are, whether we are talking about the elections in Kenya, in Liberia, the recent very dramatic events in Zimbabwe, the ongoing near-famine conditions in South Sudan, Nigeria, and Somalia, and now whatever is going on in Libya regarding the slave trade is just an abomination. And I will tell you that we are preparing now to introduce a resolution. We're just getting co-sponsors from Congress, from the House, to sign on to a resolution condemning what we are seeing in Libya, but also calling on the international community to act. And stay tuned, because I think you will see an action from the Congressional Black Caucus within a matter of days regarding this situation. So having said that, we know that the Sahel region has faced a range of interconnected challenges, including extreme poverty, food insecurity, demographic explosion, a youth bulge that the entire continent faces, high unemployment, and weak institutions. These socioeconomic challenges have been exploited by criminal and terrorist groups. One of our concerns about U.S. military involvement on the continent is that we want to make sure that the United States stays focused on addressing the root causes. We also want to make sure that at least this administration focuses, I can't say stay focused, I can say focuses on the continent of Africa. And all of us can laugh, but all of us know that we're deeply concerned about this administration and what is happening, whether we are talking about the State Department or trying to figure out what this administration's policy is going to be regarding the continent of Africa. The Sahel is also one of the world's climate change hotspots, and it has experienced more frequent droughts and floods that threaten the livelihoods of populations which overwhelmingly rely on agriculture for survival. People across the Sahel have been greatly impacted by the social, political, and economic and environmental situations, and the precarious situation has led to the region becoming a key source of and transit point for migrants from sub-Saharan Africa seeking a better life in Europe. Our panelists will discuss regional initiatives such as the G5 Sahel, regional politics, and the challenging equilibrium between security assistance and development in the Sahel. I now want to turn it over to Vivian Derryck, who will introduce and moderate the discussion. She is a veteran foreign affairs specialist and has had a long career in international development. Ms. Derryck is currently the president and CEO of the Bridges Institute, a nonprofit she founded to help strengthen African governance and leadership after serving as an inaugural fellow at the Advanced Leadership Institute Initiative at Harvard University. Ms. Derryck spent several years at USAID, where she served as the Assistant Administrator for Africa. She also worked at the Academy for Educational Development for 10 years in a variety of roles. So our format, as always, we will hear from the panelists, and then we will open it up with plenty of time for Q&A. And you know, if you have attended these policy breakfasts before, we don't force people to ask questions, but we don't want keynote speeches either. So we will take in rapid succession a number of comments or questions, and then allow the panelists to respond. So once again, thank you all for taking the time out this morning.
Good morning, everyone. First, we need to really thank Congressmember Bass for her sustained commitment to Africa and raising these issues and making sure that we keep that focus. So can we please applaud her and her good self. So Rep. Bass mentioned several events that are occurring right now as we speak. And I was going to do exactly the same thing, so I don't have to repeat it. But just to emphasize, first there's the Niger killings. And we haven't talked about the fact that ISIS now has been reduced, or some say destroyed. But what that means is that you're going to see ISIS kinds of activities popping up every place else. And one of the examples of that was Egypt and the bombing of the mosque. We also see that in Mali. Remember now that Mali, Peninsula, is the most dangerous peacekeeping force in the world. And just this past week, 4 Malian soldiers, four peacekeepers and 1 Malian soldier were killed. And then lastly, I don't know if you saw it or not, but 41 Muslim countries met in Riyadh, and they're establishing the Islamic Military Counterterrorism Coalition. So this is, I think, something that we need to be paying careful attention to, because it's led by Saudi Arabia, but apparently it's going to involve every single Muslim country in the world. So we have 3 experts here to help us think through the challenges and to come up with some really concrete ideas about what we can do next. First is Excellency Honorable Seydou Kabore, who is the Ambassador of Burkina Faso to the United States. He has more than 30 years of professional experience in the private and public sectors. He's been very much involved in banking, risk management, business management, human resources. When you read his profile, you see that this is a person who is a very accomplished professional. His current focus as ambassador is to forge trade connections to strengthen business development as well as capacity building in Burkina Faso. He's been here since December of 2016, so this is your 1-year anniversary. So we're very happy that you're on this panel. Thank you. Kamissa Camara is a fellow with the Center for African Studies at Harvard University and with Foreign Policy Interrupted. She's also the very new Sub-Saharan Africa Director at PartnersGlobal. Prior to joining PartnersGlobal, Kamissa was the Senior Program Officer for West Africa and Central Africa at the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy. She managed electoral assistance programs in Sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean, before that with IFAS, the International Foundation for Electoral Assistance. She's also the co-founder and co-chair of the Sahel Strategy Forum, which is a partnership with Bridges for full disclosure. It's an integrated policy forum that provides a platform to donors, program implementers, academics, and civil society, and the private sector. And what it does is try to promote democratic values. So Kamissa is also very well published political commentator, and I'm sure you've heard her on CNN or other American and French programs on TV and radio. So we have 2 so far, 2 excellent persons to talk about this, and the third is no less stellar, Linda Etim, who is the former USAID Assistant Administrator for Africa. A lot of time in between and a lot of changes for the continent. But she's responsible for more than $7 billion of assistance to funding for 46 countries and 29 regional and bilateral missions across sub-Saharan Africa when she was in office. Before she was the AA, she was the Deputy Assistant Administrator. And there she looked at how the U.S. focuses on stabilizing fragile states. So you know that makes her extremely important for this. Before that, she served on the National Security Council as Director for East African Affairs, and she was responsible for coordinating U.S. policy on the continent, some of the continent's most important challenges. And she spent a decade before that in specializing in African security affairs at the Department of Defense and Intelligence Community. So you see you have three persons who have extraordinary competence and expertise to be able to guide this panel. So I'm going to start with Kamissa. I'm going to ask each of them a question. They'll respond and talk for maybe 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have maybe one exchange among the excuse me, and then go to the questions. So when we think about the Sahel now, we're looking at basically the 5 countries of the G5, but we're also looking at Senegal and Nigeria, because we've certainly got to talk about Boko Haram, and so it's a little bit of an expanded definition of the Sahel. So remember that with Mali, we've had this uneasy peace, and now we have the UN peacekeeping mission. Burkina Faso, we had a bit of a challenge, but then a very good transition. Nigeria, we've got Boko Haram. Niger, we had the deaths of the Green Berets. So when you think about this broader context, you're thinking about a region that really is in some turmoil. And it has multiple stakeholders, so that's what we're going to be thinking about as we listen to our panelists. So there are governments, there are the Islamic militants, there are the more than 11,000 UN peacekeepers in Mali. We've got the 5 Sahel nations that we talked about as a group plus the other 2. Then you've got to think about citizens and civil society. What are people, regular citizens, thinking about in this? And then the international partners, including the U.S. and the P3, the African Union, ECOWAS. So this is a rich stew. So we're going to turn first to Kamissa to help us try to sort this out. Kamissa, security is the first order of business in any country, right? Foundational. So the U.S. has dedicated $60 million now to the G5 countries to help them, because apparently Secretary Tillerson asked, what can we do that's most helpful? And the countries answered to please give us some support. So is that a wise strategy on the part of the U.S.? And what are your thoughts about how these funds could be best used?
All right, thank you, Vivian, and good morning, everyone. So the U.S. pledge to fund Sahel countries is in reaction to a sad event that occurred last month and which hit close to home. The death of 4 U.S. Green Berets in Niger really triggered questions about the U.S. role in the Sahel, about the role of the U.S. in tackling extremism in the region. And some U.S. policymakers were even surprised that the U.S. was involved in the Sahel region, even though this has been the case for many, many, many years. So again, the fact that the U.S. is pledging $60 million is in reaction to the Niger event. Now, is this pledge part of a strategy or even a wise strategy? I'm not so sure. The G5 Sahel countries entail the Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Mauritania, and Chad, 5 French-speaking countries. And they do need this money to be able to secure their borders and to be able to fund their soldiers and equip them to patrol borders in the region. And they recently said that what they needed, so the first year operational budget is $500 million. So the $60 million that the U.S. is pledging for the G5 force is about 12% of the first year's budget of the G5 Sahel. So this is a wonderful move on the part of the US. However, if we want those $60 million to be effective, and I think this is the underlying question that I'm being asked here, we have to make sure that we simultaneously continue to fund critical US-led initiatives, including the Quota program, which is designed to help African militaries build their capacity through trainings and equipment to peace operations, and also the Security Governance Initiative, which was launched by President Obama back in 2014, and which addresses the nexus between governance and security. So those two initiatives, and there are more, but those two main initiatives need to be funded at the same time as we are committing the $60 million to the Sahel countries. One other point that I would like to add is that the U.S. is not going to fund the G5 Sahel as an entity. The U.S. wants to fund those countries bilaterally, meaning it is going to fund them individually, which will potentially help to shore up the G5 and combat terrorism. But this is the approach that the U.S. is taking. Again, so for the U.S. to be effective in the region, we have to make sure that this is part of a strategy that continues to fund U.S.-led initiatives, but also that tackles the issues of sustainability and predictability. And I'm not sure that we're there yet.
Thank you, Kamissa. So I'm now going to turn to Linda. Because Linda, you said three things: development, security, and politics. You're a development specialist. And we know that the root causes of jihadism, excuse me, we know that the root causes of jihadism and the problems that we've seen are poverty, food insecurity. Brett Bass just talked about the fact of climate change, and minimal and often corrupt governance. Excuse me. So, and we also see that we've had this fairly dramatic decrease in foreign assistance. So what would be the best use of these reduced foreign assistance dollars? And also, could you also assess the role of civil society and women's groups and our emphasis on resilience?
All right, and good morning, everybody, as well. And I wanted to say thank you to Congresswoman Bass. It's a very difficult set of questions to answer in 5 minutes. I think is what I'm supposed to do. So feel free later on to really dig into this, because I think that the most important point in your question is, at a time when U.S. government assistance is falling, we are acknowledging the complexity of the issues this region is facing. We have more and more U.S. troops on the ground putting their lives at risk, and yet we're drawing back funds from actually addressing and confronting and helping communities to solve and deal with the very root causes of those security challenges. It's important to say that I'll talk a little bit about where we might be able to target some of those limited funds, but I think the bottom line that I have to start with is, as a global community, we're not putting enough money into the Sahel region for economic development and governance purposes to get ahead of the challenges that the region is facing. We're not doing so. And until we do so, all of these questions of security and instability and the youth bulge, agriculture, and climate change, desertification, they can't be addressed effectively. You have governments and communities on the ground who are trying to affect change, and they're doing it with unreliable funding and drips and drabs of different initiatives. So I think just to start off to say, we know that this is a comprehensive set of challenges, and we're not, as a global community, actually investing in the ways that we need to. And that would be a great starting point, but now I'll go back to reality of where our funding is. When you look at some of the issues that are most pressing right now, the idea that you've got about 1 million children every year in this region that are dying from malnutrition is something that we don't often see. We don't treat it like a crisis in some ways anymore because people have become habituated to it. And the idea that you've got so much pressure on this young population because it's one of the youngest regions in the world, and you've got this idea of a population, right? You've got, this estimated 100 million people, which is almost doubling of the population within a 10-year period. And the estimation still is saying 200 million by 2050 people in this region when you're not increasing and upping the levels of investment in economic growth and lobbying. You also have 40% of the people in the country which are dependent on agricultural livelihoods, but 80% of the land in the region has already been degraded because of desertification, deforestation, overcropping, the fact that now we're dealing with floods and droughts and an increasing number. You can call it climate change, you can call it whatever you want, but we know that the reality on the ground is that governments in the region have been trying to grapple with this for a long time, but they can't as long as they have to respond to humanitarian crises that keep happening. So looking at this from a youth-centered lens is probably the most effective use of resources that foreign assistance could help governments in the region to accomplish. We know that you can't separate it out and say only health, only agriculture, only education. It has to be a comprehensive approach, and it has to be focused on this wide and very important youth bulge that's not going to happen, is currently happening. And so youth-centered approaches to looking at wide development issues, making sure that the U.S. government continues to fund economic growth funding, that we make sure that democracy and governance funding stays steady. This is the money that you use for food security, and this is the money that you use for livelihoods and community integration and the work with the security sector. And making sure that those humanitarian assistance levels stay at least where they were before, if not higher, because our humanitarian assistance has been working with people on the ground for years to actually move money in different ways and focus on resiliency rather than just handing out food.
Thank you, Linda. I thank you, Linda, and especially to the point about the unreliability of the funding, and the humanitarian is really crowding out traditional development assistance. So now you've got the context of both the political and security strategy, and you also have the view from a development perspective and the long-term aspects that are needed for that. So now we're going to look at a specific country and see how these factors are playing out. And the country is Burkina Faso, which is viewed as a leader in terms of making the transition to strong democracy with decentralization and finding ways in which to manage this security governance relationship. So, Ambassador, last week in the African Ministerial that Secretary Tillerson held, he asked how the U.S. could be most helpful. And as we said, your country and others said, give this more assistance. So is it helpful to you to receive the assistance in this bilateral way? How will this play out in Burkina Faso? Because you certainly don't have the funding yet. And also, given your positive experience, do you have any special insights on strategies that have been particularly useful to you in Burkina Faso that you can share with us?
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to extend my thanks to the honorable senators, Karen Bass and Mark Bissett, who graciously invited us at this important meeting. Before my response to your question, I would like to make a small description of the region of Sahel to help people to have a good understanding of the situation. the terrorist issue concerns the 5 countries, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, and Burkina Faso. And the specificity of this region is that it's really vast and unpopulated. And the terrorists, they gain the confidence of the population there because they have the fact that you have the lack of administration. The terrorists, they have the big advantage to deal with some businesses like drugs, weapons, cigarettes, cattle, fuel, and etc. So in this area, the terrorists are very rich, the leaders are rich, and they are envied by the population. And they create jobs for the population. So this issue should be understood by people. And unfortunately, the region was abandoned by the administration since the colonial time, because this region is really poor in terms of natural resources, in terms of other strategic assets, and because of the nomadic nature of the population. And what is very serious again is since 2011, the destabilization of Libya consolidated the terrorists and smugglers who set in the Sahel region with more military and financial means. So the terrorists, they found a fertile ground to grow their activity. And unfortunately, we do not have, for now, any solution. So they use the mosque and the radio to highlight and criticize the exemplary living condition of the poor population. So they gain legitimacy to the detriment of the government. So they are very seriously installed there. So now we are feeling the fact that with the defect of terrorists in Syria and Iraq, they will attempt to conquer more space in the Sahel region. So if nothing is done, there can be a kind of replica of this territory takeover in Syria and Iraq that the international community fought so hard to dismantle. So after drawing this Sahel environment, I think that to get rid of the terrorist threats in our region and to secure the region and plan to set up a program for certain economic growth that promotes job creation, we have to think about long-term solution. So for the solution, I can say that we have like 3 dimensions: security dimension, the economic solution, and the improving governance. So for the security, you have a kind of particular way that the terrorists use to attack the population. So we have to adapt our conventional defense force to this particular way to face, to resist, and to defeat them. So we need like to mobilize our units. The military forces should be used. How can I say, motorized units to go everywhere in the region because they are absent. And we have to, I think that we have to develop also the civil and military cooperation to have more confidence with the Sahel people. I think that when the military, like they want them, they can give help to them, bring like a economic project, so that the population can have faith in them and help them with more information. In the economic level, I think that it's better to set up small, how can I say, industrial units based on the raw material comparative advantages in which this part of the region have a lot of advantages, like milk, like meat, like leather. So you can produce some, how can I say, final outcome and provide, like I say, a job and revenue to this population so that they can live. I can say easily. And for the units, the surrounding of the industrial units, I think that is better to help the small farmers who are in charge to provide the units of raw material, so they can help them to enhance the skill in the management, so that they can secure, the growth or the family farms. And on the governance way, I think this one is really challenging, because it will involve the national and the local communities, even the population too. And we have to fight against, the corruption. We have to enhance the level of education of the people. We have to give, opportunity to the youth, to the women, so that they can have activities. Because when people don't have activities, they can be, convicted like tourists, who, as I said, they create jobs in the region. So for us, I will take the opportunity to thank the U.S. Government and the citizens for the grant of $60 million, which represents 12% of the budget of the G5 Sahel. But I think that the situation is very serious. So this amount is not really enough to help to cover all the expenses needed to set up action against terrorists. So I would like to inform you that in December 14, we'll have in Brussels a meeting to try to raise a lot of capital to face the terrorism. So we hope that the USAID will come to this meeting and will try to help our region.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, because you reminded us about these vast unpopulated spaces and how hard it is to govern there, and the attraction that we see sometimes in terms of the terrorists, and the fact that I think we sometimes forget how rich they are because they have these illegal means of getting money, and also the emphasis that you mentioned on involving the population, giving them a different experience and hope. So now we've heard from three persons. You've got, I think, a really strong context for our discussion. So first I'm going to ask if any of the panelists want to address a question or a comment to each other.
Maybe I'll start, and that will, I'm sure, trigger questions during the Q&A. Maybe one thing that I would like to highlight here is that the United States and all of those multilateral organizations and institutions that have been involved in the Sahel really need to start thinking about doing things differently. I think that what has been happening is that we've been reacting to events through funding, through media reports. There is a killing here, and here we fund a strategy or a military operation. And I'm not sure that this is the most effective way of engaging in a region which can easily explode in our faces if we don't really set up mechanisms to control the main challenges of the region. So it's not difficult, I think, to predict what is going to happen in the Sahel or what is going on in the Sahel. You're dealing with the weakest governments in the world. You're dealing with the poorest countries in the world, the highest birth rates, the lowest literacy rates, a a youth bulge. All of these ingredients combined is an explosive cocktail, which is, I mean, it's very easy to predict what is going to happen in this region. And even though what has been happening in Sahel is of remote importance to the U.S. or has been of remote importance to the U.S. less than 10 years ago, today the U.S. cannot say that. This is really a problem, everybody's problem, and we need to think about how to set up mechanisms that will control some of those issues that I just mentioned.
All right, so thank you for giving us additional context and for emphasizing that this is a world problem. We said at the top, and push down ISIS in one place, it pops up someplace else, and the someplace else is now Africa, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Any other comments from our panelists before we go to questions?
I apologize, I'll keep this quick, but I would be remiss if I did not address the role of women in the issue, in Sahel as well. It was one of the questions that you put to me, and because I saw my time counting down, I just didn't mention it, but I just want to say a role about the role of women, because women are often invisible in crises, but we all know that in development and instability terms, their role is essential. And they are the most affected by security concerns, climate shocks, economic downturns, and that to actually come up with sustainable solutions, if you don't have inclusive processes over time, you don't actually end up solving these basic issues. And it's been an error that we as an international community and that many countries in the region have made over and over during the years of not including the very great thinking that women's organizations and the insights that women's groups already have, having experienced years after years of the problems with seeing their young people go out and be recruited or have to go after livelihoods, or how they can prevent communities from being either radicalized or their need to actually earn a living. And so when you come back to reconciliation and how people come back into communities, the role of women is also very essential. So I don't want to leave it completely off to the side, so I wanted to mention it before we do it.
Good, thank you for doing that, because if no one else had, then you know that I was going to come back to that, so thank you. All right, so now we're going to turn to, so Ambassador would like to make a comment as well.
I would like to emphasize 2 points. The education issue, I think that's more important, one of the more important issue to solve. And secondly, I think that our poorer solution should be actually involved in the global value chain. We got to be a part of the global economic. So I think that we need to be helped in this sense. We have a lot of raw materials. Instead of exporting those raw materials, I think that the main point is to help us to set up a small industry. So industrial units which can help us to be a part of the global economy, create value, create jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I see this long list of people. So we're going to take 3 questions at a time, no statements. Identify yourself and ask your question crisply. Got it? All right, so we're going to start right here.
Thank you very much. My name is Nia. Mr. Etim, when I heard your background, I was impressed that you have security. You've done security work as well. When the Sahel G5 ministers were here last month, one of the things they said is, we need security because if we are building schools, the terrorists come and blow it up. And so we have to secure and protect our development projects. I was wondering if you agree. And Mr. Ambassador, could you please link Libya to the problems in the Sahel G5? Because your ministers made that same statement, and now Libya is in the news. But can you talk about the invasion of Libya and overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi and the impact of that on the Sahel? Thank you.
I think I can save some time by just saying, yes, I absolutely agree with the statement that security is fundamental to protecting development gains, but it shouldn't be the only thing that we focus on. We need to be thinking about development even as insecurity persists, and have a long view on how to make sure that we're moving countries and communities forward. So I do agree.
All right, we'll go to this side, and we're going to just take some.
Good morning, Hamid Lijo. I'm African Middle East analyst. Thanks for a great presentation from our panelists. I will respectfully disagree with you that actually Africa is extremely rich. This is one point. And following up on that one, we have been working and dealing with sustainable development in Africa for more than 55 years, and it seems that nothing has been changed. Is it time to actually stop completely this so-called development and talk about good governance? Thank you.
And we'll go over here.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Congresswoman Karen Pass, thank you so much for this wonderful event and the last one. My comment is, Congresswoman Karen Pass, I really thank you for doing all the work for Africa. Since we came here, we've been coming here day and night. What I would like you to do is next first meeting to hold it at the African Union. You know, sometimes you can hold stuff out of home, but we want you to come to the African Union where we have a powerful, powerful African woman ambassador who can take all this. So our question is, how do we collaborate? We've been collaborating with you, with the group speaking, because Sahel cannot do it alone. We are here, civil society, professionals are there, think tanks are there, businesses are there. How do we come together? Everybody's doing small things or big things. They don't want to collaborate with even small organization on the ground. And this is where the problem is for Africa. It didn't start yesterday, slavery in Ethiopia or anywhere. How do we collaborate? But I think the African Union ambassador has an answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Bass, for the events that shed light on African affairs. I'm Andrew Iva with the Freedom for Sudan Committee, opposing, trying to get a stop to the ongoing racist genocide in Sudan. The question I have is the contradiction between two types of reports about the terror groups in the Sudan's role in the terrorism. One, our intelligence agencies report that we support the Sudan government. We are acquiescing in them because they are so supportive in the intelligence field. That's what Senator Cory Booker said a couple of months ago in an Africa hearing, that our first American interest in Sudan is counterterrorism. On the other hand, we get a very different report from sources on the ground in the Sudanese resistance, which point out that there's militias from Boko Haram, from the Tuaregs, ISIS itself, undergoing training in certain camps in the Nuba area and in the outskirts of Kabul. Khartoum. So I'd like to see if anyone has any insights on the sponsorship of terrorist groups from Sudan, of those terrorist groups causing problems in the Sahel now. Thank you.
Yes, we'll come back to this side.
Yes, good morning. My name is Dashan Farag. I'm a reporter for RealBlackWorld.net. I would like to know, do any of the speakers feel that Africa is a good thing or a bad thing for the continent?
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Angelique Walker-Smith from Bread for the World. I'm the Senior Associate for Pan-African Church Engagement there. My question is a question of coordination and intersectionality, particularly with the legislation that our Congress has enacted relative to Electrify Africa, to AWEB, to AGOA. where do these legislative pieces fall within the strategies around the issues that we've spoken to this morning? I also, of course, would want to talk about what is the intersectionality of advocacy with faith groups, particularly in that area and also outside of that area as well. And thank you very much for your presentations.
Excellent, thank you. I think we'll take two more.
Franklin Moore. So I'm going to try to reduce this to a quick question that's not going to be easy. And I'm going to build on what the ambassador spoke of, because the ambassador talked about the variety of illegal but financially very lucrative activities that take place in the region as a way for populations to make money where the resources may not be so great. And he mentioned a variety of them. One of them he mentioned was cigarettes. We in America think that's strange. One he didn't mention is illegal pasta trade that takes place between Mali and places like Algeria. What country? Pasta.
Pasta.
Because pasta in Algeria is subsidized, and it is not subsidized anywhere else in the region. So subsidized, it's those sort of goods that create illegal activities. So my question is, what do you see as the legitimate activities that should be moving in to replace those illegal activities? We do know that in Niger, they have done a wonderful job in places like Tilbury of introducing onions and tomatoes commercially, and we have people from Benin who come to get them, but I'm interested in what the other things should be.
Thank you. You've given us a new perspective with pasta. Thank you.
It's a big product.
Good morning. I want to thank all of the panelists for coming, and also for Congressman Bass for continuing to support us. My question is about security, la sécurité en Afrique. I'm confused. AFRICOM, when the AFRICOM was created and under the commander, under the directorship of General Ward, the whole concept of Africa is that, AFRICOM is that they didn't want it to be stationed permanently in Africa. So there wouldn't be a U.S. permanent presence in Africa. I heard it very clearly from General Ward. And that's why AFRICOM, their headquarters is in Stuttgart, Deutschland, in Germany. Now, what happened? Why is there so much mission slip? And the direction has been completely, almost a 180 turn. I'm really confused about that. As a follow-up question, if we're talking about economic development, what happened to Chad? What happened to all the money, the oil money that the Mobil had when they had the pipeline from the south of Chad all the way down through Cameroon into Douala the port? Please, someone enlighten me.
Thank you. We'll take one more and then.
I'm sorry, you'll have to beg my apology. This is more of a statement. I just wanted to say I'm with the Africa's Foundation. I'm Lowery Elliott. We are actually working on integrated economic development projects in Libya, Chad, and Mali. So I just wanted to say that many of the issues that you're talking about, we're working on we actually have a strategy. We even have money. And so that is, that's part of what I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to say is that we also have Jamodi Erideri. He's from the Tubu Nation, which spans South Libya, North Chad, and Niger. And if you want any information about what's actually happening on the ground, you can have him speak. He speaks French if there's someone who can translate. There's also a South Libya Peace and Development Plan that was agreed to at the beginning of this year. He was the architect. It was signed with the Libyan government. Libya is not Arabic. It's other nations, a lot of Black Africans. So in the south in particular, there are many different tribes, the Tubu, the Tuareg, and so we're actually bringing the Deputy Prime Minister of Libya here in January, and also the Prime Minister of Chad in a couple weeks. So I didn't want to take up a lot of time, but if you want to know anything about those regions, he will be glad to provide more information if someone can translate from French to English.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
All right, so we are now going to try to address some of these questions. So I'm going to just jog your memory, and then you can answer any of these questions that you would like to, and then we'll try to have a second round, right? So we heard a challenge about that good governance and development is still an issue after 55 years. What are we going to do about it? Then we heard the suggestion to think more about the diaspora and use the African Union as a venue. The question was, how do we coordinate with the diaspora? There was a question on Sudan as being a home to terrorists, and what should we be thinking about and actions on Sudan. AFRICOM, is it good or bad? And then secondly, is there mission creep? Then we talked about that we've got reduced resources, but still there are a lot of resources, so we need to think about better coordination and intersectionality. Then we heard about the illegal goods activities and trafficking, that how can they be replaced by legitimate trade? Then strategy and money is available from our last commentator, and with a particular emphasis on South Libya. So who would like to begin to address one of these or more of these questions?
Sure. I'll start with some of the development questions, just because they seem to be in a similar thread. One is the issue of corruption and where did all of this money in the region go? Is it, the challenge, is this really a poor region, or is it misuse and mismanagement of funds? And the other idea has been decades, and development has been ongoing, and yet you still have poverty, high poverty rates, illiteracy rates, birth rates. Should we stop talking about the international community delivering aid and start talking about how we improve management and governance and what's already happening? The answer to all of those questions is yes. It's not an either or. There is a more effective way that the international community can provide assistance to strengthening, I think, the very pillars of governance that the countries in the region are trying to work on right now. The issue is that you can't disengage from the development conversation, even when you know that countries maybe could better use their resources. And the reason is because it's in the U.S. government's interest to do so. We end up responding to the humanitarian and security challenges of the region, whether or not we invest in the development approaches. However, we know that without governance, good governance, the inclusion of communities, making sure that you have women and local communities effectively trusting that their government is working in their interests. We know that if you don't have those elements in place, the sustainability of development investments is always going to be in question, and that's what I think we've seen over the past 55 years. That doesn't mean that money has been wasted, and it doesn't mean that we haven't seen substantial gains in development indicators. It's just they were worse before. It doesn't mean that we're not making improvements on the agriculture side and resilience. We are. It's just that the population's outstripping the gains that are already being made. There needs to be an acceleration of a lot of these efforts, and there needs to be more inclusion of local communities, because we already talked about the fact that there are these large ungoverned spaces, not just a focus on the central governments. So again, as we evolve in the way we think about development in the international space, we're seeing, I think, more effective targeted approaches to that. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't worked or that it's something that we shouldn't do. It just means that, yes, we also need to double down on good governance. I think the question was whether or not, with the meager funds that we're putting into the region, where foreign assistance could best be placed.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, would you like to address some of these questions?
Thank you. It's a question about how to replace illegal activities. I think that's in the context, in the current context. First of all, you have to secure the area. After that, you can move on with projects. I can say sustainable projects based on the raw material comparative advantages in each region. And the Sahel region is a breeding zone, so they have a lot of advantages. I told you, like as with milk, meat, and leather. And the solution is to invest seriously, and to help this region to be involved in the global economy. Because the country market or the regional market is very small. If you want to create a real dynamic, you have to involve them in the global economy. So I think that for me is that. So you can, we already know all the how can I say, the raw material in each region, and we can work globally on it to have the opportunity to create jobs, to create revenue for people. And we have also to accompany this strategy by education. Even you are talking about the good governance, I think that the problem with the good governance is the lack of education of the population. We have definitely have to work on this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. You talked about that before. So you and I think it's important to keep re-emphasizing that we have to invest in education, both formal and informal. And we're now going to turn to Kamissa.
Thank you. So I don't know anything about pasta, but I welcome the questions about AFRICOM. Now, is AFRICOM a good thing or a bad thing for Africa? It's a very difficult question to answer, and I will not answer that question directly. What I will say is that AFRICOM was set up in 2007 alongside the Trans-Saharan Counterterrorism Partnership that the U.S. is implementing in the Sahel-Sahara states to counter terrorism in the region. AFRICOM was never set up as a French military base in Africa. The goal has never been to set boots on the ground and to be involved in Africa as much as the Europeans have been and continue to be. So the main objective of the AFRICOM is to defend U.S. interests in the region. It's not to defend Africans, or it doesn't have a philanthropist objective, and this is important to keep in mind. There was also a question about advocacy groups and faith groups and the involvement of civil society organizations in the Sahel. They're very, very vibrant, and I think it was mentioned by Linda that the Youth Bulge also offers opportunities, and I'm putting faith groups alongside other civil society organizations groups. With all of the issues that the countries of the Sahel are experiencing, those issues also offer opportunities for civil society organizations to really step up to the plate and work in collaboration with the government, provide the government with the concerns of local populations. Again, I did mention that we're working with huge countries, and you need the relay of those civil society organizations to come to governments and speak to them about the concerns of local communities. So faith organizations, faith groups, other civil society organizations are very, very active in the region, and they certainly need funding.
Thank you, Kamissa. And I want to make sure that to go back to the point that you were making, Franklin, about the illicit trafficking, because we're learning something, and I know that it's serious about the cost. But as you were speaking, Mr. Ambassador, I'm thinking you're talking about the small inter-Sahelian markets and the need to have a greater, bigger market. Is that something that ECOWAS or the AU, or is there any regional organization that could take this up and be useful in making that connection and at the same time reducing the illicit trafficking?
that in the ECOWAS level, we talk about this issue, but unfortunately, we have other problems. How can I say? The population, to make the population free to go everywhere easily in our region, to let business people to travel as they want. Because at the borders, we have a lot of that is corruption, difficulties to let people set up really businesses. So we have the solution, but we think that it's better, I can say, to have the support of the international community to help us. And please, I would like maybe we have here the ambassador of Niger, if she can have some point of view to help us to have more details.
Niger.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
First of all, I would like to thank Honorable Helen Bass for always inviting us, and also to congratulate the panelists for really pinpointing the main issues. At the beginning, I was asked when you finish if I want to say something. I say you have said it all. So I concur with most of you who have some opinion, whether you're talking about security, whether you're talking about governance, whether you're talking about really development. We always say you cannot have security without development, and you cannot have development without security. And this is critical, I think, for us too. And one thing that Kamissa said at the beginning is really, for us, so far what we are not apprehending is what is the strategy, the U.S. strategy. I think maybe the discussion is how can we have a very holistic approach to supporting Sahelian countries. And education is very important. And when we say education, we are talking about formal and non-formal education. But we are talking about also training, professional and vocational training to capacitate people so that they can really use their skill, not only within their setting and across. And most of the time, the issue that we are facing is deep poverty. When you have deep poverty, you are exposed to any problem in the environment. So how to really reduce poverty by promoting socio-economic development in the region? That will very much be the need that we have right now. So education to really equip the youth, but socio-economic development to really give people an active opportunity to have activities that will capture them. And I wholeheartedly I agree with my colleague from Burkina Faso. We have to make AGOA also work for the people of the Sahel region. I think commodities like petrol, oil is not the only thing. We have to focus on agriculture as a basis because that's what we have. And so how do we make AGOA work? I think there is a huge capacity building. My sister Etim, she talked about women. Whenever there is war and conflict, women end up having to take care of the whole family, the whole community. How are we going to use, for example, the women entrepreneurship program to capacitate women, but yet to really infuse money so that the microcredit women can have it and take care of the livelihood of the families? I think these are the critical issues. We were talking with the National Guard in Jana Police, and they are talking about the fact that the military can work hand in hand with the civilian to really empower the community. I think we need to dig into that. But what is really kind of in the air is what is the synergetic strategy which encompasses security, development, and good governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for bringing us this good overall context. We're going to take the last